All right, let's keep going with our presentation on our video lecture on classical China and India, part 3. So next we're going to look at the Han Dynasty, and when you look at these two maps, right, so you see the Qin Dynasty, right, sometimes it's pronounced or spelled Chin, but it's really Qin. Anyway, so this is the Qin Dynasty territory, and then we see the Han Dynasty, which is the other classical dynasty of China. You notice how much larger it gets, right? It goes into Vietnam down here, into Korea up here, and into the western parts of China, right? So this would be kind of like Central Asia over here. So the Han Dynasty will become the largest of all the Chinese dynasties until later on, and it will control a very large territory. Oh my god, your favorite song. Let's do it. Let's watch it. Here we go. Sing along, please. Shang Jiao Chin Han Sui Tang Song, Sui Tang Song. Yuan Minqing Republic, Yuan Minqing Republic, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong. Alright, there we go. Chinese dynasty song, you gotta know it. Alright, so let's talk about the Han government. So, the Qin dynasty, they were awesome. They united China. They brought things back in their order. But they were evil. They were cruel, so they get kicked out. And the mandate of heaven transferred to the new dynasty, the Han. And the Han dynasty will continue ruling in China for about 400 years, bringing a lot of peace, stability, and greatness to China. So, the Han, they continue using a centralized government, just like the Qin. They start using something called the civil service exam, and they rule during a time of peace called Pax Sinica. So one of the things they do is that I copy some of the legalist ideas. So the Han are pretty strict, but they're nowhere near as strict as the Qin was. And on top of that, they start combining legalism with Confucianism. They continue this authority, centralized authority of the emperor, right? The Han emperors. And the local rulers are now chosen by the emperor instead of relying on local nobles and lords that can one day rise up against them. Now, probably the greatest of the emperors of the Han dynasty is this guy, Han Wudi, and he's famous for expanding Chinese territory into places like Korea, Vietnam, and Central Asia. There's these nomadic people that live right across China. No. Right. So up here, right, is the Jiangnu Confederation. So you have all these like nomadic people living up here, and they're constantly coming into the Han Dynasty to attack and to pillage neighborhoods and steal stuff. So they continue this like war against the Jiangnu, and eventually they defeat them. Or at least neutralize them enough to control larger territories out west. One of the big things of the Han is that they create something called the civil service exam. And this is what we call it creates a meritocracy. So here's the idea. You get all the smart people in the country. You tell them you're going to take a test to show how smart you are. And depending on how smart you are and what your test results are, is how high up in government of a position you can get. Right? So, of course, this benefits people who can read and write, which, of course, only benefits the upper class, not your average farmer. But the idea is that it doesn't matter like who your family is. It doesn't matter who do you know and who your personal connections are. What matters more is your ability, your knowledge, your intelligence, right? Your ability to prepare for this exam and pass it. So this is called the civil service exam, right? And the higher you score, the higher position is offered to you. All right, and scoring really high could land you a very high position in the Han government. And basically, every Chinese dynasty after the Han, they will continue using the civil service exam, with one exception, because it kind of brings out the best in the people, and that's what we call a meritocracy, right? So it is a kind of like a system that you can rise up based on your merits, based on your skills, your ability, and not based on who your best friend is or who your father is. So at first there weren't that many people who were educated, So that means you got to start educating a lot of people. So they built one of the first universities, right? The Chinese built their first universities during this time. And of course, you're teaching people. And of course, only people who could afford to go to university would be upper class. So when you have this kind of like combination of smart people who are educated and they take these exams and start working for the government, you create this new kind of like class of people in Chinese society, and they become known as the scholar-gentry. Now, mind you, most of these people are already going to be upper class, but now they're going to be kind of like a little bit higher than your rich person, your rich landowner, because now they work for the government as well. So these people, these administrators, right, these scholar-gentry, they become upper class society members in China. They're highly respected. They're rich because their family is probably rich, plus they're getting paid by the government for their job, and they're going to be super loyal. And it makes sense because think about it. If I get a position working for the Han government, right, I'm going to try my best to make sure that the Han government works as best as possible. Because if the Han government fails, if the Han government sucks, right, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have a rebellion. You're going to have people angry. You're going to have a new, dynasty try to take over. Which means that if the new dynasty comes and takes over, what's going to happen to me, right? A follower and supporter of the Han dynasty. Well, assuming I don't get killed, I'm probably not going to keep my job. So the Han, the employees, the government officials, these bureaucrats, scholar-gentry, they're going to be super loyal to the emperor. So if the emperor wants one thing, these people are going to do their darnest to try to get that job done. So another great accomplishment of the Han is this thing called Pax Sinica, which you remember, the Romans, during the same exact time, we had Pax Romana. So these two empires, right, the Han Chinese over here, the Romans over here, right, they exist at the same time. These people are contemporaries, meaning they exist at the same time, right? So what happens? You have Romans, controlling the Mediterranean. The Chinese are all over, Eastern or East Asia. And both of these places have peace, they have stability for over 100 years, they have economic growth and population growth. And what starts happening? Well, you see these reaches, right? This little area, right? The Persians will be here, the Indians will be here. They start trading, right? And that's the beginnings of the Silk Road. They start trading back and forth, which is great for a while, and then it kind of messes up everything. So we see a lot of trade, cities, and innovations during this time. So the Han, they are credited for starting the Silk Road. They do it. They're the first ones who send merchants across the Silk Road to start making contacts and deals and negotiations and business with the people of India, the people of Persia, the Middle East, and of course the Mediterranean, where the Romans ruled. They advance in sciences, right? They had make great advancements in sciences. One of the great advancements is in silk production. They are making more and more textiles out of silk, right? Silk is a super nice, soft fabric, and the Romans absolutely love it. And there's a very high demand and super expensive, yet, of course, the upper-class Romans want the best things in life. The Silk Road is also credited to the spread of Buddhism, which we'll talk about later on in this chapter. Because Buddhism originally starts in India, but it slowly makes its way into China and into Central Asia, because not only are merchants traveling, but monks and missionaries are traveling to spread the word of their faith. Silk production becomes the #1 export. It's called the Silk Road because the main thing that was transported was silk, right, from China to other parts of the world. Under this time, the Chinese, they invent paper. Right, the paper that you and I use nowadays is a Chinese invention. Right, the Chinese also developed the first accurate calendar, right, which is the modern calendar of 365.25 days per year. Right, that's why we have that leap year every 4 years. They're one of the first empires or civilizations to do a census. Right, just like here in the United States, we do a census every 10 years. Right, the last one being in 2010. And the idea is that you need to know exactly how many people are living in your empire to know how much taxes or how many soldiers you can get. So paper, is invented. And paper is, much easier to transport, much easier to store, and to write on. So you see a big increase in, in education in China because of this invention. The Chinese, they do a lot of, ceramics, a lot of statues, right? They love horses. That's one of the big imports that they buy from Central Asia. They want to buy horses. They also have a lot of new improvements. This is one of them. It's called the iron plow. You see the guy back here, this farmer dude. But also there's a yoke, right, which is a harness or a collar. So basically in the past, you will tie like these ropes around the animal's neck, and you get the animal to drag the plow, this big heavy metal thing, across the soil in your farm. And kind of the problem is that it would choke out the animal, choke the horse. So many animals would simply, die or get injured. So by kind of rearranging or changing the way that the harness works, so that the pressure isn't on the neck but around the shoulders, right? Then the animal can produce more work, right? Can pull this heavy plow through the soil, and therefore make room to plant more and more seeds, and therefore make farming more and more productive. The Chinese, the Han, they invent cast iron, right? So imagine that there's a mold of a shape like a pot or a pan. You pour molten iron into it, right, into that cast, and it sets as it hardens. It sets and takes that shape, right? And that means you can produce stuff much, much faster, like weapons and tools. And if you can produce it faster, you can produce it cheaper. So that means more people are going to be armed with iron weapons, and more farmers are going to have iron tools, which increases more and more and more food production. So the end result of all this productivity is urbanization and population growth. The Chinese have these huge cities, right? The capital being this one, Chang'an, right? Still exists, right? And this was as big and as awesome as, say, Rome during the same time period. Right? And this was the political capital, economic capital as well. And so you have, hundreds of thousands of people living in there. Many of them were artisans. Many people were workers or were government employees or were merchants, right? And you had, of course, a lot of farmers who worked in the surrounding farmland. Now, the Chinese also, they start sailing during this time. And they start expanding their trade with Southeast Asia, right? And they start making these long sea voyages, and they go from China to Southeast Asia, from Southeast Asia eventually to India, and they start using a lot of new technologies that have slowly made their way from one part of the world to the other. One of them being this one, right? This is called the astrolabe or astrolabe. And basically, it allows you to measure latitude. Right? That is how far north or how far south you have gone from the equator. So you can kind of make a guess as to how far you are from home or from your destination. We kind of see the first kind of like rudimentary basic versions of the compass, right? That tells you north, south, east, and west. Right? That's a Chinese invention as well. Here's another one. It's called the sternpost rudder. Now, we all seen, the Pirates of the Caribbean movies or any old sailing ship type of movies, right? We see the sea captain with a big wheel and he's turning it, right? That's the rudder. That's what kind of steers the ship. And you can imagine that this is absolutely crucial when you're like trying to steer a ship through rocky waters or up a river. But the point is that this invention, this another Chinese invention, allows ships to sail, safely, more accurately, right? You have the better control of the ship. The Chinese, right? So the Chinese are up here. This is China, right? So they start sailing to the Philippines. They sail to Vietnam. They sail to Malaysia, to Indonesia, right? So all of this is Southeast Asia, right? And so they'll sail from here to here and then back, right? Very few Chinese will sail all the way across the Indian Ocean, like to India. And none of them would have gone all the way over here to like Arabia or to East Africa. But we start seeing that Chinese, sell stuff and trade stuff over here. Then these merchants are going to sail to India and trade stuff over here. The Indians are going to sell, stuff over here in these other parts. So this is what we call the maritime Silk Roads, or sometimes it's called the Indian Ocean Trade Network. It's the same thing. And eventually this trade system, this trade network, right, that uses the monsoon winds that allows people to, harness wind power, basically, and, travel long distance across this Indian Ocean. It, basically, this will be the place where we're going to see a lot of exchange of ideas and goods and technology, but also religion. Religions are going to spread thanks to this. All right, so let's talk about the collapse, the decline of the Han. Right, so just like Rome was, had its great peak during the Pax Romana, and then eventually started a slow decline. Same thing happens with the Han Chinese. So one of the problems is disease. All right, so these merchants traveling across Central Asia, through Persia, India, Mediterranean, right? We have all these people moving back and forth, and eventually disease catches on. People get sick, measles, smallpox, bubonic plague, and when they go back home to China, they infect all their friends and family and neighbors, and we have as much as 1 out of 4 people dead, 25% people dead, as millions and millions of Chinese people dead because of disease. And so we have all these, people dying left and right, and basically you have also, that's causing a lot of problems. But you also have, just like you did in Rome, you have what we call a wage gap, right? So you have rich people who control a lot of land and were wealthy and, beyond imagination. And then you had millions and millions of poor people who own nothing. And the only way they survive is by, working for a wealthy landowner, and, they only get a small crop, a small share of the crops that they grow. So you have all these landless peasants who don't have land for themselves, and they're like, hey, you know what, Han Dynasty people, you gotta give us land, because it's totally unfair that a small percentage of the rich people control so much and everyone else controls nothing. And the Han government, they kind of tried to say, okay, let's take away land from the rich people and give it to the poor people to make it, the poor people happy. And of course, the rich people were like, no, we don't want to give away our land because it's our land. And the Han was like, okay. And so the end result is that, land redistribution, it doesn't really work out. And of course, the peasants, when they don't get what they want, they're going to rebel. So you have something called the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And these are peasants who are like, you know what, the Han are not doing a good job. They're not looking out for the little people. They're not trying to help the peasants. Forget them. They do not deserve the mandate of heaven. Right? Because they're not looking out for the people. They're only looking out for the rich people. So mix that, anger amongst the peasants. Combine that with famines, because now people are dying from disease, and if everyone's dying from disease, no one is growing crops, so now there's a food shortage. So you combine all these things, this all these natural disasters mixed with political problems, and it's very clear, right? These are signs from the heavens that the Han Dynasty does not deserve to rule anymore. So you have, millions of people dying during this rebellion, from disease, from famine, from war, and eventually the Han Dynasty is overthrown. And for the next 200-year period after this, we have another time period, kind of like the Warring States. So this time is called the Three Kingdoms period, where China is broken up into 3 kingdoms, and each one is trying to fight to see who has the next, or who will become the next dynasty. So they went from the Warring States to the Qin to the Han, which was awesome, and then back to violence and civil war. And that's the end of the Han Dynasty. All right, so that's it. Let's continue with our next video. Thanks for watching.